Hello everybody, welcome to this video. In this one we're taking a look at the whips in Dark Souls 2. There are only 5 whips in the game, and they all act and behave pretty much exactly the same. General for the whips is that they don't really poise break very well, and your character stands still as you're attacking with them. One pretty useful ring that I think could be paired with the whips for this reason is the stone ring. Since your character stands still, it can be really useful to make sure you stagger the enemy, because let's say you're power stancing some of these whips, your recovery is going to be quite slow, so you want to make sure that the enemy is staggered and doesn't poise break through your attack and hits you. Whips have very long range. I mentioned in the shields video how you sometimes want to bait enemies to attack you in Dark Souls 2. Once enemies get within a certain range of your character, it triggers their animation to attack. Certain enemies you can actually keep at bay with whips because they have such a ridiculous reach. If you pair that with the stone ring, you can pretty much just stagger lock them until they're dead. And some of the whips are pretty interesting because they add poison and bleed, an incredible amount of poison and bleed actually. And they also have certain attacks that hit all around. The only thing you have to be careful with though when you are fighting multiple enemies is of course if some of them don't get staggered. But whips can be really fun to play with for sure. Now let's start off by taking a look at the first one, which is just the normal whip. This thing upgrades with regular Titanite. You find it in Soldier's Rest in the Forest of Fallen Giants, and the damage on it isn't anything special. My favorite way to use this whip is when I make my way through the Black Gulch to destroy the statues, because even if you don't have the stats to use it, it's very helpful for that in particular. When you do the running attack with whips, you kind of do a spin. That is pretty good for crowd control as well as destroying those statues like I mentioned. But besides that, it's not one of the stronger whips though. It's kind of just like an introduction to the weapon class. Anyways, the next one is the Bloodied Whip. This whip has the longest reach of any of the whips, and you get it from the torturer enemies in Huntsman's Copse as you're making your way to the Executioner's Chariot. It has to be the enemy that's actually wielding this whip. This one doesn't actually have bleed on it despite the name, but it does do significantly more damage than the normal whip, and it also has 20 poise break, which is the same as the straight sword class. This whip also has one of the lower dexterities, although it can be a little bit difficult to get. If you manage to get it, you could two-hand it, and you'd be doing some decent damage. This one also upgrades with normal Titanite, but it weighs 3 units though, so a little bit more. You can definitely catch people by surprise due to the range of this whip. I think whips are the weapons that have the most range in the game. But yeah, let's go to the next one. Next up is the Old Whip. You can get this technically in the beginning of the game. It's one of the weapons that the crows drop in Things Betwixt. And this thing is the strongest of the whips, although it does have the least durability at only 40. And they upgrade with Twinkling Titanite. But the Old Whip is very famous for the amount of damage that you can do. One of my favorite ways to use whips is to power stance them and do the strong attack where the whips both hit at the same time. With my character, I was almost able to do 1000 damage, so they can be pretty effective. They can also be buffed and infused if you choose to do that. So yeah, generally, if you want to do the most damage possible, the Old Whips are the ones to use. One of the weaknesses of whips in PvP though is shields, because they won't really guard break an enemy, so getting through them with a shield is pretty difficult. However, they cannot be parried. Now, if you want to annoy somebody that is turtling up against you, you may want to use one of the next 2 whips on the list, starting with the Notched Whip. You can find one of these in Huntsman's Copse, again, as you're making your way up to the Executioner's Chariot. I don't know if those enemies are really called torturers, but they have 2 whips in their vicinity, so maybe that's why people decided to call them that. Anyways, you can find one of the Notched Whips in the Crown of the Sunken King DLC as well, and that one will be upgraded to +7, so that can be pretty useful. This thing does an insane amount of bleed damage. It's one of the best bleed weapons, but it cannot be buffed and infused with bleed though. You can also not buff it with the rest, and so this is pretty much all you got. However, for extra bleed buildup, you can wear the Shadow Gauntlets as well as the Crest of Blood, which you find at Blood Covenant after defeating the Executioner's Chariot. These things are one of my favorites, because when I use whips, I like to just mess around, and bleeding enemies can be pretty fun. If you've got the right build, you can sometimes bleed enemies in one power stance attack with these things, or even combine it with the next weapon, which is pretty similar, just does poison damage instead. That weapon is the Spotted Whip. These ones can be infused if you want to do that. You can also buff them with a staff, and if you want extra poison damage, you could put on the Crest of the Rat, as well as the Sanctum Soldier Gauntlets. Now these things act very similar to the Notched Whip. With the right build, you can certainly poison some enemies extremely fast, and you get them from the Soul of the Demon of Songs in Shrine of Amana. However, these things, since they're boss weapons, upgrade with Petrified Dragon Bones, so I don't tend to use them until a couple of New Game Pluses into the game, but they are also one of the best poison weapons. One cool thing you can do is combine the Spotted Whip and the Notched Whip, power stance them and both bleed and poison enemies at the same time. It is quite satisfying to do. One of the best things to learn when you're playing with whips though is to gauge the distance between you and the enemy, because you will be able to outrange a lot of the enemies. In Dark Souls 2, enemies have more range than it looks like because they get like a little bit of phantom range on their weapon. And if you get an enemy to drop their weapon and you compare it to their size, they usually have a longer weapon than yours. So enemies essentially have longer range than you. That is not always the case when you're using whips, unless the enemy is really effing big. But it's kind of nice how this game has a lot of weapons that you have to play a different way with them. Another pretty cool thing that you can do with whips is hit enemies through walls. This works a little better if you're hitting straight through the wall, however. So admittedly, it's not that useful. But I have to say I did have a lot of fun doing this to some enemies. Because sometimes when enemies hit you through the wall, it kind of seems cheap and unfair. But because these whips have so much range, you can hit them and stagger them through the wall while they have no chance of getting you. One final thing that I'll say about the whips though is that since they don't weigh very much, and this especially applies to the bleed and the poison whips, you can use them in boss fights, switch to them when the boss has a stage where he's taking reduced damage, like the Smelter Demon and Velstad for example, bleed or poison them, or both, and then switch back to your normal weapon. The best would be to have 2 of these whips power stance when you do this, but yeah, that can be just an additional way of doing damage to bosses if you want to play that way. Anyways, that was all for this video. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.